Continuing education knows that at the end, students want to graduate, and we can help them do that because we take the time to really listen to their needs, and we understand all the different options that are available across the campus for them.
We don't take a cookie cutter approach. We realize each student comes with their own story. So whether it's a part-time student looking to complete a degree program or someone just looking for online courses, we're there to connect them to the resources of the university.
Okay. All right. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming to CWA. Today's panel is Why Are Grandma and Grandpa Running the Country? It's a snarky title and one that doesn't really recognize the incredible wisdom that exists within our elders, and we are all so appreciative of that. But also such an appropriate title for a year when we have the two oldest ever candidates for president, and our Congress is still average age is 25 years above the average age of Americans. You know, the future belongs to young people, so why aren't more young people getting involved? That's what we're gonna dive into today. My name is Jill Adler-Grano. I am currently a graduate student here at the university studying housing through the lens of urban geography. But prior to that, I was elected to Boulder City Council in my early 30s, a while ago now, as one of the youngest council members at the time. I then went on to work for 3 years running district outreach for Congressman Joe Neguse, one of our youngest Democratic leaders and one of the youngest members of leadership in the House of Representatives. Representative Neguse and I first met appropriately at New Era, Colorado, an organization that he helped co-found, and I was an original board member. And we worked for 5 years together, tirelessly trying to engage young people in our democratic process. So those are the reasons I think they chose me for to be the moderator. For recording purposes, today is the 11th of April, 2024. It is noon, and we are panel 17986, titled, Why Are Grandma and Grandpa Running the Country? All right, before we get started, I want to give a land acknowledgement. The University of Colorado Boulder, Colorado's flagship university, honors and recognizes the contributions of Indigenous peoples in our state. CU Boulder acknowledges that it's located on the traditional territories and ancestral homelands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Ute, and many other Native American nations. Their forced removal from these territories has caused devastating and lasting impacts. While the University of Colorado Boulder can never undo or rectify the devastation wrought on Indigenous peoples, we commit to improving and enhancing engagement with Indigenous peoples and issues locally and globally. We'll do this by recognizing and amplifying the voices of Indigenous CU Boulder students, staff, faculty, and their work. We'll do it by educating and conducting research, supporting student success, and integrating Indigenous knowledge. By consulting, engaging, and working collaboratively with tribal nations to enhance our ability to provide access and culturally sensitive support and to recruit, retain, and graduate Native American students in a climate that's inclusive and respectful. All right, before I hand it over to our esteemed panelists, I want to say one other thing. We want to make sure that you have a chance to ask questions. So here's how we're going to handle the Q&A. We'll reserve the end of the discussion for that Q&A. We're using a note card system. Folks are walking up and down the aisles now with note cards. At any point in the session, simply raise your hand and request a note card and a pencil from one of our producers. Please write legibly. If you're a student, please note this in your question on the card. Students will get priority with their questions. When you finish writing your question, raise your hand and a producer will come get it from you. I urge everyone to make their questions brief and to the point. All right, and now we're going to introduce our panelists. First, to my left is Rebecca Buckwalter Posa. Rebecca is a renowned activist and advocate. She provides commentary on law, politics, and policy for various media outlets. She made history as the first named plaintiff in Columbia University's successful First Amendment lawsuit against Donald Trump, barring him from blocking journalists and constituents on Twitter. Pause for applause. With extensive experience in progressive campaigns and policy projects globally, including as Deputy National Press Secretary for the DNC in 2008, Rebecca co-founded PRISM, a publication highlighting underrepresented leaders. She recently co-authored a book with James Carville called 40 More Years, How Democrats Will Rule the Next Generation. Great title. All right. Next, we have Billy Carney. Billy is the chairman and co-founder of Roken News, a groundbreaking digital media company revolutionizing news consumption for young people. Since its launch in August 2020, Roken News has amassed an impressive 5 million followers and subscribers across various platforms, including social media and newsletter. It's recognized as one of the fastest growing news companies globally and has secured $6 million in venture funding. Billy is a proud New Jersey native and graduated from the University of Notre Dame in 2018. Billy's innovative approach to news media is reshaping the industry, making him a notable figure in the digital media landscape. In fact, just this year, Billy was recognized as being in Forbes 30 Under 30 for media. Congratulations on that. That's a huge achievement.
Thank you.
Next, we have Devin Gray. Devin's the president of End Poverty in California, EPIC, an advocacy organization founded by former Stockton Mayor Michael Tubbs. Devin is dedicated to advancing a statewide policy agenda that promotes equal opportunity for all and challenges outdated stereotypes surrounding poverty. Prior to his role at EPIC, Devin served as Tubbs' chief of staff and has an extensive background in policy and advocacy. He was a special advisor to the governor's chief of staff in Governor Gavin Newsom's administration and a policy advisor for Beto O'Rourke's presidential campaign, focusing on gun safety and criminal justice reform. Devin's a graduate of Stanford Law School and the Stanford School of Education. His work and writing have been featured in various publications, including Cal Matters, Newsweek, and The Hill. Devin's commitment to social justice and poverty alleviation makes him a valuable voice in California's policy landscape. Thanks so much for being here. All right, and last but not least, we have Ian Millhiser, a senior correspondent at Vox, focusing on the Supreme Court, the Constitution, and the decline of liberal democracy in the United States. Formerly a columnist at Think Progress, Ian brings a wealth of experience and insight into his analysis of legal and political issues. He clerked for Judge Eric Clay of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit Court and served as a Teach for America Corps member in the Mississippi Delta. He's a graduate of Duke University Law School and is the author of 2 books on the Supreme Court: Injustices, the Supreme Court's History of Confronting the Comfortable and Afflicting the Afflicted, and The Agenda, How a Republican Supreme Court is Reshaping America. His work provides valuable insight into the legal and political landscape of the United States. Thank you for being here, Ian. All right. With that, I'm going to turn it over to you for introductions and opening comments. Why don't we go down the line, and then we can kind of come back around, and then we'll be ad hoc.
Well, so I'm Rebecca Buckwalter Posa. My pronouns are she, her, and ella. And thank you so much for being here and for having me at CWA. It's a privilege to join. We know our politicians are on the older side. We know we need new blood. I think we think about this typically in terms of registration and turnout and voting and running for office, but I think that what I'd be most interested to explore with my co-panelists is how we can use social, civic, and cultural mechanisms to change norms, not just think about the programs we could fund or the organizations we could create that do the things that we're already trying to do, but to actually cause a shift in the way that we culturally and socially treat civic engagement, voting, and running for office. And I think that that's a critical part of changing the average age of our elected officials. Thank you all.
Hi, all. I'm Billy Carney from Roca News. I think those are all awesome topics to explore. From my perspective, it's certainly, I think, an issue that the politicians are aging. At the same time, I think it is good to have some diversity of age. So I certainly don't think the solution is, kick out everybody who's over a certain age and bring in purely new blood. I think really the diversity of thought is excellent, and would love to explore with my panelists the best way to achieve that.
Thanks, everyone. Devin Gray, lead an organization called EPIC End Poverty in California. So grateful everyone's here. I think it's so strange seeing so many people come out for a panel with at least 3 people who went to law school. We're usually pretty boring. So it means a lot. Really appreciate it. Our organization is, primarily doing advocacy work and narrative change work and power building work. So we think a lot about what are the structures and incentives that lead to certain populations having power versus others. And I think this question about, the generations of leadership and who is in there and who isn't is fundamentally a question about power, right? And I think there are forces that keep the status quo in power, and there are also forces that I think inhibit the next generation from being able to acquire power. And I think we'll dive into some of those things, but I think I was talking about this on the last panel that I was on, that I think young people are sort of systemically disempowered based off of policy choices that have been made over the last few generations that have made it harder for us to sort of find our economic footing in a way that previous generations were able to achieve in their 20s that we are now experiencing more in our 30s and 40s. So I think that if we want our politics to be more reflective of the country writ large, we need to make sure that all of our metrics of power are similarly situated as well. So, but looking forward to the conversation.
All right. Well, I'm going to use my time to defend Grandpa Joe. Or at least to defend the choice to have him be the name on the ballot this term. So the way that Joe Biden got to be president, in 2020, you had an incredibly diverse Democratic primary that represented all of the factions and all of the rifts and fissures that exist within the Democratic Party. I mean, at an extraordinarily granular level. Like if you were a single-payer health supporter, you could choose between the social democracy that Bernie Sanders was offering, or you could choose the more technocratic left liberalism that Elizabeth Warren was offering. There were 4 women senators on the ballot. There was the first gay candidate who had ever made a successful, or at least a credible bid for the presidency. There were Black and Latino candidates who had served at the highest levels of government, clearly qualified to be president of the United States. And with all of the opportunities to choose amongst all of the factions and fissures and various groups that make up the Democratic coalition, the party chose safety. And they chose safety for a very simple reason. Most Democrats believe that defeating Donald Trump was a matter of such transcendent importance that we should put off the internal debate about what the Democratic Party wants its future to be. We should put off the contentious process that normally goes into a party and choose the candidate who represented continuity with the last consensus within the party that was able to form a majority coalition. We chose Obama's vice president. And we did that because we realized that holding this coalition together was more important than making sure that any particular faction within this coalition would get to be on top. Defeating Trump was what mattered. And I think that was the correct choice. If 50,000 voters in Wisconsin, Arizona, and Georgia had not shown up, that's about 0.03% of the electorate. Trump would have gotten a second term. This was a nail biter of an election. Safety was the right call in 2020. And so now here we are in 2024. Biden is trying to hold together an extraordinarily difficult coalition to hold together. You know, in Congress, you've got everyone from AOC to Joe Manchin represented, and in the broader coalition that he needs, you know, which does make up a majority of the country, but the broader anti-Trump coalition consists of everyone from literal socialists to people who would enthusiastically vote for a traditional anti-government Republican like Paul Ryan. You've got to get all of those people to show up in order to defeat Donald Trump in 2024. And there's a name for this kind of coalition. You know, it derives from some of the fights in the 1930s. Some of the leftist parties in Europe realized that there was a fascist threat. There was a threat that threatened to destroy their political movement and potentially to end their lives. And so they formed governments. They were called Popular Front coalitions. The idea behind a Popular Front coalition is you get all of the factions together that believe in democracy, and you stick together and you form a government because keeping your democracy is more important than anything else. These things are hard to hold together. You know, the French Popular Front lasted for about a little more than a year. You know, Israel recently had what was essentially a Popular Front government trying to keep Bibi Netanyahu out of power. I think we all know how that turned out. So these are difficult things to hold together. And given that difficulty, I want you to imagine for a sec what would have happened if there had been a primary this year instead of being just running the incumbent. So it would have taken place in the middle of the Gaza war, and because I know how contentious this issue is, I do not want to get into the substance of that. I simply want to say that there are some Democrats who have views on the Israel-Palestine conflict that are incompatible with the views that other large numbers of Democrats have on the Israel-Palestine conflict. All of those rifts would have been opened up in the primary. There would have been a single-payer healthcare candidate, and if the last two Democratic primaries are any sign, and I'll preface this by saying I'm a supporter of single-payer healthcare. I voted for Elizabeth Warren in 2020. There would have been a single-payer healthcare candidate, and if passed as precedent, that candidate would have gotten 35% of the vote, and they would have lost. And then a lot of the people who are single-payer supporters would have been pissed. You know, every possible rift would have been opened up. There are people who believe very strongly Kamala Harris is the vice president, and if a black, if a woman of color were passed over for someone else, they'd be very offended by that. There are other people who feel very strongly they do not want Kamala Harris to be the nominee. Again, I don't want to get into the substance of that. It's just a big rift. Every rift would have been opened up, and then after all of these fissures formed within the party, after everyone was furious at everyone else, we would have then gone into a general election, and that candidate would have had to reassemble the same Popular Front coalition that elected Joe Biden. We made the right choice. The Democratic Party made the right choice by not opening up those fissures in 2024.
Okay. Well, all right. So even if we concede or completely agree that it was the right choice, still we are in this unprecedented time in history, right, where we have the first octogenarian as our president and someone not too much younger running for president. I want to hear from some of these other panelists. You know, what's at stake here? What does this mean for the future? And then I want to wrap back around to you, Devin, about the systemic barriers to entry. But first, let's talk about what we're risking. Who wants to go? And feel free to interrupt each other, too, and argue with each other a little bit. Let's spice it up here.
I can jump in real
Please,
quick
yeah.
before handing over. I think what's at stake in terms of Joe Biden and Donald Trump's ages is just the fact that they're potentially cognitively declining substantially. And I don't think, there's anything necessarily wrong with someone who's over 80 taking office if they're with it. But at the same time, I think there are serious questions about Joe Biden's mental state. Like, look at Bernie Sanders. He's 82, but he's sharp as a tack. I don't know if you can necessarily say that about Joe Biden. So I think that's a concern. I think, an age limit being introduced to politics isn't really practically realistic. However, if there's some sort of cognitive assessment that can be put into place, like the one Nikki Haley suggested a couple of years ago, I think that could be beneficial for both parties.
Oh, interesting. Okay, who here supports an age limit? Anyone? What about a cognitive assessment? That's so interesting. I haven't heard that. Show of hands in the audience. Anyone? Okay. Other thoughts on this topic or idea?
My view on sort of the phrase like gerontocracy gets thrown around a lot, and I feel like my reaction to that is so much more applied to like Congress and the courts than it is the presidential election. Like I don't disagree with anything that Ian said about like the decision of the party to not run a credible alternative. I think that the forces that lead to Congress's median age being so wildly out of step with the general population are quite different than the forces that led to Joe Biden and Donald Trump having a rematch 4 years later. Like I think factors like incumbency advantage and name ID and the resources and the political capital that you have are probably much more causal to having two octogenarians or having someone who's in their late 70s and early 80s be on the general election ballot. So I guess I'm just not so concerned about the presidential election being like sort of the tip of the pyramid of this, maybe larger problem we have of young people not being able to accumulate political power. I think it's just much more applied to other places. But I think the problem is that people recognize that their members of Congress and the Senate don't look like them. And that creates sort of an undercurrent of frustration, if not resentment, towards people of our age cohort not being in positions of political power. And then it manifests in sort of this, it comes to a head when you see the general election candidates that we have, right? But I just don't think that it's actually necessarily accurate to say that the same forces that lead to government generally being of a different age cohort being the same, having the same causes as Biden and Trump, which, who are two massive politicians that have very broad coalitions and have found political success because they've been able to tap into those.
So we were pretty wrong when we named this book 40 More Years. In my defense, it was 2009. I'd just come off the Obama campaign, and we did a stunning amount of original research, demographic research into the changing face of the country. And our theory was pretty simple. The Republican Party is counting on a dying cohort. And we went to Matthew Dowd's memo for George W. Bush, which was essentially, it's this simple. We have fewer voters, we have to galvanize them, we have to get every one of them out there, and that's the only way we can continue to win as the rest of the country becomes more diverse. So why were James and I so wrong? The Electoral College, voter suppression, apathy. I mean, many of these forces. And to go to one of Devin's points, I think that representation is really, really important. And I think one of the other factors is we have this federal focus, and we have, the West Wing's great. Love it, watch it all the time. Sure, okay. I don't watch it all the time, but I think too many people do, maybe. And we need more of a Parks and Rec focus if you're going to put this in television terms. And for people to engage at the local level, both to build up the bench of people who are qualified to serve in government. Thank you, Jill. And to diversify, to ensure that the people who are serving in government, who are serving as judges, that our potential voters, the people who should be registering to vote, who should be turning out, can look at government and see potential for themselves, to feel represented in that in a meaningful way. I think focusing on age is reductive, honestly. I think that diversity of thought, which is, I appreciate your point very much, Billy, is critical, but there are so many other forms of diversity, and I'm just not interested in talking one more time about how old Donald Trump is or how old Joe Biden is. I'm interested in the people they surround themselves with. I'm interested in the policies they're making. And having staffed Joe Biden in 2008, I can tell you, he's always been prone to gaffes, prone to a lot of the things that folks are pointing to now, and looking at differently because they're encouraged to do so. They're primed in the language of media studies to view the same things that Joe Biden's been doing for decades in a new light. And I think it's much more important, and again, shifting away from the federal and especially away from the executive, from this singular office, but who are the people he's surrounded himself with, who he's entrusted? And I think, a historic number of women cabinet members, and that's enormous. And for me, as someone who is gay and Latina and a second-generation American, the forms of representation he's brought into government, I think, are incredibly significant. And I would just hate, I do hate to see all of these accomplishments and all of these really meaningful developments bypassed or glossed over. Or just the fact, I think, I'm losing count, which is a wonderful thing. He's appointed no fewer than 35 black women to the federal judiciary. He has appointed in one term more LGBTQ judges than Barack Obama did in 2. These are astonishing accomplishments, and these are important things that we should be including in this conversation.
Yeah.
Rebecca, can I
No.
Can I just talk about how old Donald Trump is for 2 minutes?
And then we're going to shift to Parks and Rec.
Sure. Because I want to offer a theory, since I offered a theory as to why Joe Biden is the nominee, as to why the Republican Party also has an old guy as the nominee, which is, so the electorate, the median voter in the United States is in their 50s. The electorate, older people are much more likely to turn out in elections, and that's largely because voting correlates with being economically secure and being established in your community, and the more you've lived, the more time you've had to become economically secure and established in your community. So the electorate tends to be much older than the average American. One thing I know, because I work from media, is that, I am 46 years old, and the culture is already moving away from me. In media, they talk about we talk a lot about the 18 to 54 demographic. That's the only people that anyone wants to advertise to. The younger you are, the more advertisers care about you. And the reason for that is because when you're young, you don't have established brand preferences. If you drive a Ford truck right now, you're probably going to drive Ford trucks for the rest of your life. If you prefer Coke to Pepsi, you're going to prefer Coke to Pepsi probably for the rest of your life. But if you haven't made a decision yet, that's the people that the advertisers want to get their stuff in front of. And that has all kinds of downstream effects for our culture, because the advertisers are running their stuff next to the stuff that I'm writing as a journalist. They're running their stuff next to the stuff that Hollywood is producing. And so Hollywood is producing its content for young people. They're producing it for young people because that's what the advertisers want them to produce. And so you have a culture that is focused on what are 20 and 30-year-olds thinking. And you have a democracy that is focused on what 50, 60, 70, and 80-year-olds are concerned with. And I think it's created a very particular divide, where there are a large number of voters who feel very alienated from a culture that has moved away from them. And again, I'm 46, I already feel it moving away from me. I can't imagine what it's going to feel like when I'm 80, and I've experienced it moving away from me for many decades. I don't think that's a basis for me to form my politics. But there are many people who I think have formed a politics around that resentment of seeing the culture move away from them, and that is what Donald Trump appeals to, is that specific resentment. that feeling that the culture is moving away from us. It is something that is baked into the way that our economy and our democracy is structured. And the reason why someone like Trump was able to rise is, again, the very voters who are least served by our cultural institutions are the ones who are disproportionately the most powerful within our electorate, because they're the most likely to turn out.
Yeah, it's so interesting. You commented that it's, it takes time to establish yourself right before you run for office. And, moving away from the federal level, even, at the local level, so many young people can't engage. It takes so much time. Everyone's working, just trying to afford housing. And to use the Parks and Rec example, it can be a little disillusioning. It's not that sexy. Do you remember the opening scene when Amy Poehler's on a playground, like trying to pull the little girl playing? How would you rate the playground equipment? 1 to 4. It takes a tremendous amount of boots on the ground, time and effort. So there are barriers to that. Devin, I'd love to go to you because you kind of addressed some of those in your opening, but more hinted at them. So what do you see?
Yeah, so to Ian's point, if voting correlates to economic security, political leadership is like 10 times more correlative to economic security, right? And you mentioned dealing with housing costs. I mean, in California, obviously, we are known for having exorbitant housing costs. It's what's led to California having, over a 3-year average, the highest rate of poverty of any state in the country, which is shocking, given how much wealth we have. We have our legislature, which is bicameral, has 120 members. 115 are homeowners and only 5 are renters. And this is in a state that has a very high rate of, or a very low rate of homeownership, very high rate of renting. So I think that if we want to start even discussing how we are able to redistribute political power, whether it be just through voting share or actual office holding, there has to be a conversation about what are we doing to give people power in every facet of life. I think we've seen really from the founding of this country that, folks who were, it was only like landed gentry basically who could participate in the political system. All the founding fathers were, massive landowners, and not much is, obviously a lot's changed, but that same thread still exists, obviously, where it's very, very difficult to achieve any sort of meaningful political power if you don't simultaneously have control over your physical domain. You don't have control and agency over the trajectory of your life. So I think it's really depressing in some ways that we have all these aspirations of young people to participate in the political system, and yet it's actually very hard for them to participate in the economy. I just don't think that we can disaggregate the two. So I think, I've sort of said it before, but we look at the policy choices that we've made around student loans and around the high cost of education being a barrier to entering the middle class. We talk about the housing costs in California, and as I've learned in Boulder as well, real challenges in trying to just build the supply of housing to be able to drive down costs for folks. It makes it prohibitive to be able to stay in a place and to set up roots and to be an active member in your community, which is a prerequisite for being an effective elected official. So I think all of these things are linked, and economic security really is the first box you have to tick to be able to be an effective political participant in so many ways. And we see it manifest in a lot of ways outside of politics too, but I think we would be derelict, certainly in our role as advocates around economic security, to not draw those lines between people having money in their pocket and a sense of security and ownership and agency over themselves and the economy, and ultimately political participation and leadership as well.
I want to stay on this topic and incorporate a question from one of our CU students in the audience, which is, that congressional members are often millionaires. How do we make running for office more accessible to the working class? You hit on some of the problems. What are some of the solutions?
I'm sure folks have thoughts on this as well. Obviously, there's the public financing ideas that people have, where if you raise a certain threshold in a local municipal election, the state or the local government sort of matches funds once you become sort of a credible candidate. I think that's meaningful. But I think that I kind of feel like the toothpaste is out of the tube in some ways, right? We have multi-million-dollar campaigns for state ledge races in California. You talk to folks in other countries, a parliamentary race in Britain, and it's just it's a fraction of that for a constituency that's just as large and just as important. So I think we have a lot to do to try to reform campaign finance law. Obviously, we can talk about Citizens United and overturning McCain-Feingold and all these things that are a bit more technocratic that the other lawyers on the panel can certainly dive into. But I'm worried that the cat's kind of out of the bag in terms of how we just have extraordinarily expensive elections. I know someone who is running for a seat on like the Parks Commission in the East Bay of California, a really, really like entry-level type campaign that one would do, and she has to raise like between 50 and 100 grand for it. So it's just silly, right? It's silly and it's prohibitive, obviously, and I think it leads to obviously having a different demography of folks who are in elected office, and ultimately that's going to ladder to policy decisions as well, because I think we all probably agree that having the lived experience of certain perspectives leads to different policy outcomes more often than not.
Maybe I'll just jump in here. I think those are awesome points, and also kind of playing into the power politics thing. I think ballot access for other candidates is also important. Look at, every single president since 1853 has been a Republican or a Democrat. And especially after Ross Perot in 92 essentially took the popular vote from Bill Clinton. Now in every single state, you need a different amount of signatures to get on the ballot at different times during the year. And it's crazy. Even at, the state level, like you were talking about, in 2018, after Governor Andrew Cuomo came in office, the Working Families Party chose not to support him when he was running. And as a result, he gets into office, makes it 3 times harder to get on the ballot the next time around. It's like people who are in power want to stay in power. And, they completely pull the ladder up. And I think ballot access for candidates also is something that should be looked at as well.
I want to respond to the third party point, because the reasons why we don't have a viable third party in the United States, I think, have more to do with the broad structure of how we do elections. There is a French political scientist and former legislator named Maurice Duverger, who is famous for this theory, which is that in a system that has what is called a first-past-the-post system, and a first-past-the-post system means that whoever gets a plurality of the votes wins. So if you have 17 candidates on the ballot and the one who got 17% got more than everyone else, the person who got 17% gets elected in a first-past-the-post system. Most U.S. jurisdictions have a first-past-the-post system. Some do not. Maine does not. Alaska does not. But most U.S. jurisdictions have a first-past-the-post system. And Duverger's law is that when you have a first-past-the-post system, that will always tend to a two-party system. And the reason why is because of the Ralph Nader effect. If a third party shows up, what will happen is that the third party will draw supporters from whichever major party is most similar to the third party, and the candidate that the third party supporters like the least will wind up getting elected. That's what happened in 2000. Ralph Nader was most like Al Gore. Because he was on the ballot, George Bush got elected. And so you can have a third party, but in order to get to a multi-party system, we have to make fundamental changes in the structure of how, we have to do what Maine and Alaska have done, and you could have an instant runoff voting system. There are lots of alternatives to this system. Instant runoff voting is when the candidates on the ballot, this is what Maine and Alaska do, you rank them. And if your first choice doesn't get it, then your vote automatically switches to your second choice. And if your second choice doesn't get it, then your vote automatically switches to your third choice. And in those systems, you can have as many parties as you want. Because if Ralph Nader's on the ballot, you can mark him 1, you can mark Al Gore number 2. And you're not helping elect George W. Bush if you prefer Ralph Nader to Al Gore. But if we want to have something other than a two-party system, that requires, it's not quite constitutional reform, but it requires this sub-constitutional reform where we have to change the way that we choose who wins our elections.
Yeah. Fully agree. Something we've done in California. Something we've done in California at the local level, like the mayoral races in San Francisco are done with ranked choice voting, and I think people are satisfied with that. One thing I would add that I should have mentioned is I also think the number of elected officials that we have in our legislature is probably too small. We've not increased the number of representatives, 435 in the House of Representatives, in a really long time. And I think what that leads to is people feeling increasingly disconnected from the representation, because every member of Congress represents 750,000 people. In California, we're certainly guilty of that as well. We're a state of 40 million people. We have 40 senators, so each senator represents 1 million people, which of course leads to prohibitively expensive elections because you have to reach so many folks, and obviously a huge disconnect between representatives and the people that they serve. So I think, it's sort of an arbitrary number that we have, but other, certainly some states like New Hampshire, I believe in Virginia, have like hundreds of members in their lower chamber of their legislature. And I think it leads to people feeling like they have a bit more of political agency themselves to be able to participate because they actually probably know the person who's representing them in the Capitol.
Right. Right. Boulder just moved to ranked choice voting for our mayor, and just recently we had that election. It was interesting, right? It did allow a sort of Boulder version of a third party to run, and we got to see what the community's sort of appetite for that was. In speaking of systemic change that you guys were both just on the topic of, a lot of our questions revolve around a particular topic, which is the Electoral College. And do you think that plays into, the average age being older?
I think it's a terrible idea.
Yeah.
I don't know if it contributes to the age of the candidates, but I mean, I think that most of the worst episodes about in all of American history have centered around the times where we've said that one American is less equal than another American.
Yeah.
I think as a political inequality should always be the rule, or political equality, I'm sorry, should always be the rule. Yeah, and it makes no sense to have a system where, like, if you live in LA, your vote basically doesn't count, and if you live in rural Michigan, you're a super voter. It also skews just what policies get enacted. I mean, Iowa used to be a swing state, and so it was ethanol subsidies were untouchable because they were important to Iowa voters. Meanwhile, if you live in Illinois, I'm sure there are people in Illinois who have like concerns that are unique to Illinois. Their concerns don't get brought up at all by presidential candidates because they're not a swing state. The same thing is true about Alabama. So yeah, I think it's a bad idea. I don't know that it's necessarily a causal factor in why we have older candidates.
Any other thoughts on the Electoral College? We had 3 questions on that.
I feel like, Rebecca, you mentioned the Electoral College, so I don't want to step on any toes, but I think I agree. I don't think that this is a credible argument, but you probably could argue that the swing states in the Midwest probably do skew older in terms of their average age, so it might change the voting population a little bit. But I also think that the Senate apportionment of every state having 2 senators and sort of leaving certain states underrepresented probably also leads to like an older Senate, because there's so few seats to go around. It's sort of the same argument around expanding the number of seats in the House. I think when you have only 2 Senate seats in California, it's naturally going to skew older because seniority is going to be rewarded, and there's fewer opportunities and less space for a young upstart candidate who maybe has a small, political constituency, but is able to, be the 8th senator, which is something that California should have if we were equally apportioned and not disenfranchised. But obviously, I have a point of view on that, being from California. So, yeah.
I think the electoral. Oh, okay, I'm back. I think the Electoral College is one more structure that creates a layer between citizens, not just voters, citizens, residents, people, and government. And in that sense, is a problem, particularly for younger people. It's also another structure that requires free time, energy, and resources to participate and to be part of. And so those are 2 of the reasons, in addition to the fact that it's a terrible idea, that I think it has a particularly disaffecting or disempowering sort of feel for younger voters. It's, what is this thing between me and the office I'm voting for that's occupied by people who can afford to be part of it, who can afford to devote energy and time to this process. And as Jill's pointed out, as many of our panelists have pointed out, so many people don't have the time, the luxury even to register and to vote. I mean, it's been, Australia, it's mandatory, right? Other places, it's a holiday. voting shouldn't be that hard. Registering to vote shouldn't be that hard. So I'll stop my rabbit hole dive, and we can move on to the next rabbit hole.
I'm trying to kind of go by how many people are engaging with a particular topic, and there's one that's really coming up, which is really interesting, and it's the demographics of this room. We have college students commenting that the room feels older and they don't see themselves represented in the room. Where are my friends? We have other folks who are presumably not in college and older saying, look around the room. For the most part, we are elderly. A major concern for me is how do we engage younger people to be interested in the future? We have someone else saying, I'm noticing that this panel is kind of young. Where are the older people on the panel? So, we're all looking at each other saying, who represents me? And then there's one that in my mind kind of bridges the divide, which is what considerations have been given to the idea of senior politicians mentoring younger aspiring politicians, and is it the need to continually fundraise? That is kind of at odds with this.
I'll certainly say that the need to fundraise contributes both to the fact that candidates tend to be older and to the fact that they tend to be richer. All of politics is relationships. I think that the mistake that dorks like me who follow politics religiously fall into is we think that people are voting on policies or most of politics is that you have politicians who form relationships with leaders, with groups, with important preachers, with important community leaders, and then as you move up the chain, you form relationships with bigger and more powerful groups and individuals, and you form relationships with donors. And the more time you've been alive, the more time you have to build those relationships, and so that gives you an advantage. And of course, the reason why rich people are at an advantage, there are lots of reasons why rich people are at an advantage, but one of the biggest ones, when I considered running for office once, I took a course that former director of Emily's List taught on basically how to run for office. And what she told me I was signing up for, this is why I decided not to do it, was I was going to spend 8 months of my life where my full-time job was picking up the phone and calling everyone I know and dialing for dollars. And I would have been at an advantage when I was doing that because I went to law school. So some of the people on my list are partners at law firms and actually can afford to write me a large check if they are so enraptured with my candidacy that they would like to do so. If I were a welder, I would not know many partners in law firms. And so again, politics is about who you know. And when you've had more time to know people, and when you are in a position in life when you know a lot of rich people, both of those are tremendous advantages.
Do any of the rest of you want to address the campaigning? There are 2 questions in here around campaign finance reform. Do you think that has a role as well? Certainly, we just talked about money in politics.
Yeah, the races are getting more expensive. The percentage of people relative to the number of positions is shrinking. The population's getting older, which is a good thing. People are living longer, which is a good thing. I think my take on this is that, on the mentorship piece, which I think is interesting, it's kind of tough to be a mentor to an up-and-coming politician if they're not already a politician, right? I was reading the Robert Caro book on LBJ, which is a fascinating biography. Would recommend to everyone. When he was a congressional aide, and then found mentorship there, and then was eventually in Congress and found mentorship there, and sort of climbed his way up. But that first step is has barriers for most people, right? It's not always so easy to become a congressional staffer because we don't pay congressional staff very well. So if you're coming from a working class background, might have to support family, it's very difficult to sort of make your way on Capitol Hill. And then to be there long enough and to forego all those wages that you would have in your career to be able to gain those relationships, like Ian was talking about, these relationships with the labor unions and the donors and everyone else who would matter when you decide to take your turn at it. The turnover, I don't know if y'all know the stats, but like the turnover rate on the Hill is remarkably, like it's very high. People don't last very long because they're so underpaid. So I think there's so many structural factors that make the idea of mentorship, which has been so foundational for so many of our like giant politicians in our history, it makes it very difficult for people today to be able to sustain that if you don't already come from means. So I think at the end of the day, it always comes back to financial power being sort of the lubricant for achieving political success.
Any other thoughts before we move on?
I guess I'll just add on there. I totally agree. It feels like, if you're actually young and up and coming and trying to raise funding for a campaign, if you don't know people from your previous life, it's like, where's the money going to come from? The only thing that comes to my mind is if this person is essentially an internet celebrity. And you see a lot of these Twitch streamers and people who make content on YouTube and TikTok, some of it is political. If someone like that went out and tried to raise capital, and these people, it's amazing, are donated from their viewers for no reason, millions of dollars a year. If they genuinely went out and tried to raise that money for a campaign, I bet they could do it. But anything short of celebrity status, I find it hard to see how someone under 35 could possibly raise the fundings needed for a campaign.
Billy, I have a question for you because you've raised venture funds, right, for your work. Mm-hmm. And obviously there's barriers to entry for that, but at least there's like institutions. Like you can go to Y Combinator and like try to get money if you have a startup idea, right? And there are some institutions like that in politics, Emily's List being, I think, the first one that comes to mind. But the amount of money is just, it's apples and oranges in terms of what people with, the right idea and energy to do something, right? And obviously, making a startup is not something that's immediately accessible to like 95% of young people, with that caveat. But I wonder if there's something that political institutions can learn from Silicon Valley about how to invest in young people early on. I think there might be something there, with all of the obvious caveats that like every sort of societal bias goes into determining who gets money and who doesn't. Like if we can sort of accept that, I think there might be something there. And I don't know if you have thoughts on your experience raising money for that, because I think, it's an interesting idea and like obviously got a lot of support.
No, it's a great point, and honestly not one I've thought about before. Yeah. So we, as you said, even for us, we were extremely lucky to even be able to start a company. Yeah. I worked in finance for a couple of years beforehand, so I had some money, and also, two loving parents who, at the end of the day, if, shit hit the fan, I can go home and live there. And so, able to afford ourselves the time and opportunity to do that is one thing. I don't know if that's something that can be solved very easily. But it's an interesting idea. Like we raised our first seed round in the early 2022. And to get to that point, the kind of Silicon Valley model that was employed is that you've grown to 1 million followers on Instagram in a year doing this content. I bet if I gave you, some money, you could take it to the moon. And we were not making any money at the time. There was no real return this investor was getting, but that's like the mindset of the Silicon Valley model. It's, visionary, what can you do? Funny enough, in New York, the financing for startups is very different. It's very focused on how much money did you make? Okay, multiply that by whatever multiple. But no, that's an awesome idea. I don't have any thoughts on it right now, but cool to consider.
I might express a little skepticism about the VC model, at least for federal candidates. And the reason why is because of the donation cap.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. Like, I mean, we've made a intentional policy decision. Like when Lyndon Johnson ran for Senate the first time, he had an oil millionaire that basically paid for his entire campaign. Yeah. That used to be a thing that you could do. And we decided that we don't want that. We don't want politicians to be beholden to a single rich person or to a handful of rich people. But the consequence of that decision, I mean, I don't necessarily think that was the wrong decision.
I know where you're going. Yeah.
Yeah, is that now you have to be beholden to several thousand rich people if you want to run for Congress. because you can't raise a big lump sum. You have to raise, I think, is it like $2,700 increments now?
Yeah, federally, yeah, that's what it is.
Yeah.
No, it's like an irony, like an unintended irony that the campaign finance laws have actually probably entrenched incumbents more, right? It's sort of strange, but it's true.
That's interesting. You know, on the point of money, we have a CU student who says, you know, with regard to Ian's point about networks and running for office, how can we make running for office without having any connections and being an outsider easier? There's another sort of question/comment from the audience, though, that may answer that, which is there are many lower level elected offices that require no money, and some take little time. Example, there's a half dozen water districts in Boulder County, a good start for CU students, especially science majors. Building the young people bench is a project that we should be working on. Count every race. What are your thoughts on both those questions, or the question and comment?
For an opportunity to say there's a terrific organization, some of you may be familiar with, Run for Something.
Oh.
Amanda Littman founded it, and it's brilliant. It's, you know, and I'm on the board of an organization, LPAC, the only organization that exists for the sole purpose of electing queer women in the United States. And we provide tools and support. But I think another piece of it, to go back to my civic engagement point, is, and perhaps sort of a corollary to the question about venture capital and raising money, is encouraging people to donate, to get involved in that way, for small dollar donations to not just be the topic of news articles, but the norm, and for, I mean, it's a small way, but a significant way for people to engage and to feel invested. I'm reminded of a thing James Carville said, not to me, but maybe it's one of the things that drew me to him, that the best thing you could do if you're a politician looking for a vote is to sleep on someone's couch. It's not to have them come sleep on your couch or hand them something, but to have that person feel invested in you. They've given you something, they want to see it through. And so I do think a lot about how a scarcity mindset, or very valid concerns about finances, economic security, are prohibitive, right? Both running for office, but participating in the way of donating to a candidate that makes you care about that candidate, care about that race, normalize that as a place you put your time, your energy, and your money. And that's yet another reason that Devin's points about economic security are so important to this conversation.
All right, well, we've talked a lot about money and opportunity. You know, there are a few comments in here, a couple from college students and one from the parent of two college graduates, about just how disenfranchised people feel. You know, they just don't feel like anyone represents them. And the notes here are that it's kind of a downward spiral from there, right? What do we do? We're in the middle of this big time, especially with what's going on in the Middle East. Mm-hmm.
I mean,
big question.
I can jump in here real quick. The first thing that comes to my mind is that there's kind of a disengagement with media, and I think in news media, and you know, the average age of a Fox or MSNBC viewer or CNN viewer, it's all over like 65 years old. And younger people are on TikTok, they're on Twitch, they're on YouTube, and they're watching their favorite streamer play video games, or they're watching, you know, someone maybe talk about politics in their living room. And I don't think there's going to be a switch at some point in which people say, oh, suddenly I want to watch a guy in a suit on TV. I think the way information is being distributed to older and younger people is very different. And, you know, I think starting with that, there needs to be some way for us to have conversations with people of different generations, but it seems like the mode in which information is delivered is just so distant right now.
Who's even heard of Twitch? I haven't.
So Twitch is like, it's this platform that you watch people play video games on, and you'll watch them play the video game, and you see their face, and it's like they just comment on their own playing. And it's Amazon bought it a few years ago. It's amazing how big this is.
Now I'm thinking my son watches Twitch all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think there's points that everyone on the panel has made that I think answer to that question of like, why are we disillusioned? Like Rebecca, you've talked about like the structural factors around the Electoral College and the distance, between people and the political outcomes that they have. Billy, you've talked about media. Ian, you've talked about all the structural forces that have led to candidates that people might not be satisfied with because we have broad coalitions. I think all of that is super true. But also like, people are really busy and struggling, and I think it's hard to engage with a system that for many folks feel is not delivering for them, even despite achieving electoral victories, right? I think if people's material conditions don't change in ways that they themselves can feel, whether that's like true or not, because sometimes there's like a delta between people's perception of the economy, and like their own wages, like that exists, and that's something that like we have to grapple with as people who are Democrats, we're part of the party. So I think we have to deal with that, especially for this re-election coming up. But I think there's like real reasons that everyone's articulated, and I don't think there's a silver bullet that we can do to solve the disillusion, but we have to have a very comprehensive approach to make people feel that, one, that they're seen by their elected officials, but also that their votes not only lead to results electorally, but also in terms of like the effectuation of policy changes that can help them and their communities. I think it's like a massive question that is not going to be able to have a single answer, but I think we've all touched on it in our own way.
Most elections are actually decided by very simple frameworks. Do you want to stay the course or get on a new horse, right? And I think, harkening back to 2008, hope versus fear is one of the simplest dynamics that comes into play, and I think right now it is perhaps the biggest dynamic that is driving the election. Going back to the first presidential elections that I worked on, or actually before that to Bush, it was, can we put up someone that people want to vote for, or are we just relying on people voting against Bush? And that was not a good place to be. And I am hopeful that at the larger level, at the federal level, in this presidential cycle, we find a better way to navigate things. But hope and fear are, I think, the underlying issues. Yeah, and if I had a more eloquent way to discuss that, I'd probably be in office myself, but.
I think there's a particular reason why an unusually large number of voters feel disenfranchised right now, and this is true globally, which is that the post-pandemic period sucks. And it's like, it's no one's fault. But like, we have been disappointed so many times. We all thought once the vaccines came out, we were gonna get shot girl summer. And instead, we got 8% inflation. And like, that is not anyone's fault. Like, it is not any politician's fault that we dismantled our supply chains when we, sent 40% of the workers home. Like that, that's just a thing that happened, and we had to rebuild. You think Joe Biden's poll numbers are bad? Look at the leader of literally every other democracy in the world. Biden has better poll numbers than Olaf Scholz in Germany, than Rishi Sunak in Great Britain, than Emmanuel Macron in France, than the Prime Minister. I keep going. The Prime Minister of Japan. Basically anyone who was the incumbent during this post-pandemic period, their poll numbers are in the toilet. And the reason why is because people are really upset that things suck. What I am afraid is going to happen, though, is the reason why Joe Biden is outpolling, even though his numbers are not great, The reason why that Joe Biden is outpolling all of these other world leaders is because the United States is the best performing country in the world. We have the best economy. We have recovered quicker. Our inflation dropped fairly quickly compared to our peer nations, and we have far and away the fastest GDP growth among our peer nations. And so I worry that the fact that things are objectively not good right now is leaning people to sour, not just on a politician who's done a pretty good job, or at least better than any other world leader in leading us through it, but is going to lead us to make the wrong policy conclusions. You know, the reason why the United States is the strongest economic nation right now is because we built such a robust temporary welfare state during the pandemic. We did exactly what we've known since, you know, Alan Keyes you're supposed to do in an economic downturn, which is to vomit money everywhere. That is exactly what you are supposed to do. It worked. We are outperforming all the other nations. And yes, we did experience inflation, but it is no worse here than it is everywhere else, and it is better than most countries here. And I worried that this strategy we pursued in both the Trump and the Biden administrations, which was the correct strategy, will wind up being discredited because people are so mad. So like, I think that the question of like, are there structural problems in the United States that make people disenfranchised is one question. It's separate from why is there such a huge number of people who feel disconnected from politics right now? And I think the reason for that is material conditions are objectively bad in the entire world, and they are much worse than we thought they would be at this point. And I just hope that we don't make a decision that is not easily corrected because of that.
So interesting. Yeah, love the point about our Keynesian approach in the age of neoliberalism. We have just 3 minutes left, so I want to give our panelists the opportunity to just give a brief closing remark, 45 seconds or a minute, and then well, thank you for being here and go on with our day.
Well, I think we should start with the end. It's only fair. We started at the end.
All right, brief.
I mean,
down the line.
I'll go back to my opening remarks. Sometimes the old wisdom is correct. You know, to everything there is a season and a time and a purpose under heaven. And now is a time to cling tight to things that are precious. You know, the best thing that Joe Biden is offering us is that if he wins, we know there will be an election in 2028. And in that election, we can elect the young candidate of our dreams. But let's make sure that we have that election.
Wow.
Sort of tie some of these things together. So I lead an anti-poverty organization. I spend a lot of time talking to people who are making below the poverty line, which is already quite low in this country. And I think ultimately the cause of poverty is not people's individual failings, it's just like not having enough money, right? And sort of piggyback on what Ian was saying around the response that we had to the pandemic, we made really good policy decisions to just infuse people's pockets with so much money, so much so that we cut child poverty in half in a single year. And then, unfortunately, it didn't end that way because Senate Republicans and Joe Manchin killed the expanded child tax credit. That's a different talk for a different day. But I think what the point that I'm trying to get to is if we want to live in a body politic where young people and families and working people have political agency to both participate in the democracy and then ultimately lead the democracy, we have to be continuing to make those types of investments in people, especially low-income people, to give them the platform for which they can have ownership and autonomy over their own domain and then ultimately the broader politics as well.
Yes, thank you, Jill. That was awesome, and thank you all for coming out. I think, as I said at the beginning, mix of old and young, I think, is the sweet spot, Devin. I think the point about economic security being, quintessential here for getting any of that done is the key point, at least in my opinion. So that was awesome, and yeah, thank you all again.
I think Ian's made a particularly compelling point about the post-pandemic period, because of course COVID is still with us. But Another thing that's, I mean, I haven't been in a room like this in literally years. And so many people, for so many reasons, had to isolate relative to what normal social engagement was before the pandemic. And a thought I'd love to leave you with is that one of the most important things we can do for our democracy and for representation right now is to actively, thoughtfully reconnect with other people and set the model, set the norm for the people around you, where if we say, hey, this room's a little older, I know I'm casually now embracing the term middle-aged, but model that behavior. I have a 17-year-old godson, and the best thing I can do for him is answer his questions, encourage his questions, and model behavior for him that involves civic engagement, that involves thinking about these matters. And it's a wonderful thing that you're all here today. Thank you for joining us, and that CWA is happening. And thank you, Jill, so much for this opportunity and for your thoughtful moderation.
Thank you all for being here. Thank you, panelists. Books are on sale outside. Go get them, even if they're incorrectly titled. Thank you.